at this point, I'd like to call the July 15th, 2024 Planning Commission to order. It's 7:03 p.m. And first is the roll call. So I am present. I'm Chair Luke Maruziak, Vice Chair Tessman.
Present.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Kilcup.
Present.
We know that Commissioner Crone is absent. Commissioner Lambert. Let's see him there. And that's it. Okay. At this point, we do have a quorum, so I'm going to continue the meeting, open it up for public comment. If there's any in-person attendees, seeing none, move on to the next item. I'd like to approve the agenda for July 15th as written. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, agenda is approved. And now we move into the council liaison report. And we'll recognize Council Member Johnson.
Greetings, Commission. We just did the big thing that we've all been waiting for the last few months, which is adopting the non-utility capital improvement plan. That includes a street resurfacing program, as is pretty much a rolling program. You can probably expect that for the foreseeable future. A sidewalk improvement program, which addresses uneven sidewalks, and a playground replacement program, where the Parks and Public Works Department has a schedule of that goes out many years to eventually replace all of the playgrounds. So all the wooden ones and stuff, eventually they're all going to go. It's just a question of timing. And then two major projects, along with a number of other things. But the River Trail project, formerly known as the Riverwalk, and also the Community Center expansion project. That's the one that, as is usual, I like to focus on, as we did as a council. So the plan going into adopting the CIP was to have two tanks. We'd have a 6-lane lap pool and then an activity pool that would also have a current channel. Okay. At present, as we were entering into these conversations, we were and continued to be around 5 million short, a little north of 5 million short on funds. And the administration had suggested that we would close that gap with a line of credit, which would eventually be converted into a bond if we ended up using that line of credit. If we never used the line of credit, it wouldn't have mattered. But if we did dip into it, it would have been in the form of a bond. That, by the way, was intended to be paid off using REIT, real estate excise tax, for the future. I think it was out 20 years or so. I don't remember the exact number, but something like that. But it would not have required an increase in taxes. However, the council declined that option in favor of grants, appropriations, and donations, etc. Other funds possible as well, but essentially those kinds of things. And what that led the administration to do was to come up with 3 possible options, alternatives from their original proposal. One of them was to have a 1-year delay, which was what the council had originally said to do, but they wanted to come back with a few other possibilities just for us to be able to pick from. A 2-year delay was the second option, and then the last option was to scale the project back and make it significantly smaller. Council opted for the 1-year delay. And what this does mean is that the overall cost will be higher, but we will be able to keep pace for the most part with expected sales tax and real estate excise tax. So still not looking to have to increase taxes to get this done. The 2-year option would have had us actually falling farther behind because some funds from the Y would no longer have been available, specifically a grant that they were looking at. So we would have lost over $1 million on that alone. And then the scaled back model, the third option, would have had just one tank with the 6 lanes and the bare minimum in terms of locker room space. And mostly because of the fears that that wouldn't meet the needs of the community, why we spend so much money on something that would be it would not be adequate to our needs. The council opted to not take that option. So those are the reasons why I went with the 1-year delay. Let's see. Oh, also the scale back model would have also required a substantial subsidy to the Y from the city. And that would have been an ongoing cost. So currently, we're back to being around 5 million short, but as a footnote was adopted by the council to the CIP, as soon as those funds are secured through, again, grants, appropriations, donations, those kinds of things, not bonds, then the council is very likely to approve the contract and begin construction. That said, we don't have the contract right in front of us. Council could do whatever, but it is extremely likely that we would approve a contract once we would have such funds secured. The 1-year delay gives the city time to secure such funds. However, our position is even better than where we were before, especially if you look back a few months to a year ago. We're in a significantly better position. That $5 million can be closed in a number of ways. If we get a King County Aquatics grant for $4 million, which Skyview got recently, although that required them, in order to be able to execute on their plans, they would have had to have had a bond pass the voters. Since that did not pass, they're going to have to return those funds. But our project is significantly closer to being fully funded. And we also have the project shovel ready, meaning that we have the plans in place where as soon as we had the money, they could start digging into the ground. They could put the shovels in the ground. So we're in a very good spot for getting those funds. And that's, again, $4 million, leaving us a little over $1 million behind, which is a much smaller ask than when we had previously approached the school district and our legislators, et cetera, for funds. In the past, we were thinking 3-5 million. Now it's a much smaller ask from any of those entities to close that funding gap, which makes getting such funds much more likely. Also, the school district would be getting a competition pool since it will have enough space for such competitions. And as a regional asset, we think, and going all the way north of King County up into Snoqualmie County, as the valley does stretch that far, of course, this would be a regional asset that we think the state would be interested, the tribe, and maybe even North Bend and Skyview, since this would reduce pressure on their own aquatics facility. So we're not quite there yet, but we are a stone's throw away, and I am optimistic that we'll be able to close the gap within the next year. The current plan does not include a bond, increasing taxes, and due to the design build process, it also cannot balloon in costs. If the costs do balloon, it's not on us, it's going to be on the contractor to fill in that gap. So I'm very optimistic on that. I will take questions, which they may come on that topic, but I'll go ahead and just roll through the other couple of things if that's right with the chair.
Yes, very good.
Also, of note, the city had requested that the Department of Transportation look at the stretch of 202 that's next to the elk fields, and if the speed is appropriate for that area, given the hazard of the elk crossing, along with the fact that it's just kind of a narrow road right through there. They did take a look into it. They did a traffic study and concluded that the speed should be reduced from 50 to 40 miles an hour. However, the way the process works is, for reasons that I'm not going to speculate on, they told us that we have to then give a recommendation to WashDOT to actually make that change. So anyway, the council went ahead and did that and requested for the speed reduction. The other big thing that council did was, well, we didn't really take an action on it. It was more just an introduction and giving a little bit of guidance to the administration, was looking at a rate study for our utilities. Our rates are currently comparable to surrounding areas, with some surrounding areas being higher than ours, some are being lower, but we're not extremely high or extremely low in either direction. However, with inflation and capital costs and staffing needs, there's a very strong possibility that rates will need to go up over the next few years. And since council doesn't just take a guess as to what they think it should be, the city has hired a contractor. I believe they're called Financial Consulting Solutions. I think that's right. And they are conducting the study. They did present us with a few different models we could look at on the range from essentially borrowing as much as possible, which would require us to be in a significant amount of debt for a very long period of time, or paying for everything in cash, which would require us to, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I think that it was an 80% increase in our rates starting next year, which of course the council opted to not take that route. But then there's kind of a hybrid model that's in between where we do some cash and some financing and kind of make things a little bit more in balance. So we don't have numbers on hand of this is what we are going to do because we haven't finished the study yet. We just gave a little bit of direction as to how we think that the administration should move forward in working with our contractor. And eventually they will come back with a recommendation to council. The administration also gave a brief overview of the utility CIP, capital improvement plan. And I don't want to go into too many details there, but effectively the utility capital improvement plan is it's difficult to say no to projects because if you do, the water starts going the wrong direction in the pipes and you start running into problems where you'd be out of compliance with state laws and stuff. So most of that stuff is things that are difficult to negotiate on. But they did present us with a few things, certain improvements to our facilities, et cetera. And I'm sure that in future meetings, they'll give us a few more details on those projects. They were just giving us a basic overview. Okay, that was about it. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, excellent. I'll do a round robin. Commissioner Kilcup, any questions for Councilmember Johnson?
I did have a question about the YMCA project, or I'm not sure what we're calling it. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. The GMP with the contractor, what is the time frame that remains active? When will that expire?
Yeah, we haven't actually asked for the greatest maximum price, but staff has a good idea of what it will be, you know, kind of ballpark. Or what it's likely to be. And they actually told us that they believe that they were overestimating, if anything, what it would be. So we haven't actually asked for it. I believe that it's 30 days, but don't quote me on that. It might be, it might not be. Yeah, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head of when we asked for the GMP, how much time we have. But we will not ask for the GMP until we have what we think are the funds secured. And if it ends up being a little bit north of that, it's not going to be by a huge amount. So I'm not too worried about that at this point.
Okay, that's it.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Smith?
I don't think I have any questions. That was a really thorough explanation of the various options considered. Thank you, Councilman. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Vice Chair Tessman?
Not related to anything covered by the update, but just trying to see if there is an update on the splash pad at all.
Yeah. Right, about the splash pad. So we, as a council, were offered a tour of the CIP projects ahead of and during and mostly ahead of most of our conversation about it, where the administration took us around to see a lot of the projects. And one of the ones we stopped at was the splash pad. And I believe that our tour was in mid to late June. I don't have the date right off the top of my head, but it was around then. And it was supposed to be done by now, effectively. And I remember looking at this dirt pile thinking, really? And that was the last that the contractor had told the administration. They said that was what they knew. Apparently that is not the case. However, I can say that I have personally seen them out there working hard on it recently. And it will likely be done by the end of summer. Hard to say if it will be in time for anyone to enjoy it this year, unfortunately. So there's a lot of disappointment from the administration and the council, and most importantly, of course, from our community about the fact that it's going to get done later than what we thought we were told.
Okay, okay. Commissioner Tessman,
No, it is what it is.
I
Thank you.
see, Commissioner Kirkhope has a hand up. Go ahead.
I did just want to say I live right behind the park right there, and there's been like 1 or 2 active days. So I'm curious, did we put some kind of liquidated damages into that contractor's contract so that since we're gonna blow by? I mean, when the sign went up in March, I was like, maybe. But July, I had a friend point out to me that there is no year on there, it just says July. Yeah, just kidding. But I am curious, like, is there some form of liquidated damages? And if not, is that looked at internally for our contracts? Like, we should definitely have some kind of teeth in those.
Yes, I believe the administration is looking into those kinds of things. I'm definitely not going to speak off the cuff about it because, yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what specifically that would be. But it will be an area of active discussion, I'm sure, at the Parks and Public Works Committee would be my guess.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the detailed overview. I did 2 questions on what you had briefed. And I really appreciate the community center expansions. I did have some questions. You answered most of them. You mentioned 3 things, though. You said grants, donations. So grant would be the Sideview grant if that rolled over, or another grant. Donation if a angel came in. But you also mentioned appropriations.
Yeah, that'd be from the state.
So if the state decides to appropriate more money for us to have a pool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Huh, okay, that's interesting. And then you mentioned we made a recommendation to slow down 202, which I think is a good idea. That 50 miles an hour is a little bit fast when the elk decide to cross. But what did we recommend they slow it down to?
40 miles
40.
per hour.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Good. Good.
That's what WashDOT recommended. So we went with them.
Okay. Okay. Good. That's all the questions. So thank you, Councilmember Johnson.
All right.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much.
At this point, move on to item number 1. I moved that we approve the minutes dated June 3rd, 2024 as written. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, those minutes are approved. And then we move into the second agenda item, critical areas ordinance update.
Yes, hello, commissioners. We have our senior wetland biologist, Jeff Gray, online to introduce a new set of code amendments. It's the critical areas update to the code using best available science. There is a handy memo in your packet. Hopefully you read to kind of frame this work. It is very scientific. It can get very technical, but Jeff will break it down for us. Are you there, Jeff?
I am. Can you
Nice.
guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. All right. I think that was my cue to go ahead. It was I prepared a little presentation to go along with it to try to streamline some of the presentation and information today. Do you guys have that? Or it's 2024 in a virtual meeting, so I can also share my screen. Does that work for you guys if I have a presentation? Is that better? Okay. All right.
Feel free to share. But
Okay.
we do have it if you need help.
No, this is good. All right. I've not done Zoom for a while. I've been on Microsoft Teams for a couple of years. Okay. Well, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jeff Gray. Working for the city of Snoqualmie since 2015. OTAC has been the city's planning department consultant since I think 2004, or if not before, as Sheldon Associates, if you remember that outfit, going back to reviewing the original SR2, Snoqualmie Ridge 2 development. So we have a long history with the city. implementing critical areas, development reviews, and really the values of the city. So in that vein, I've been supporting Emily currently on the best available science, comp plan, and code update every 10 years. And so we're up for review again. I think the last time the critical areas code was updated was 2016. The 2016 update was a pretty big overhaul compared to, I think we were still going with the 2004 critical areas code at that time. So there was a big change at that time. And there's less of a change, I would say, in this round, but there is, you know, a couple of topics that that would be, you know, potentially significantly different than what the code says now, and that mainly is focused on streams. So I will go ahead. Let's see here. I guess as an introduction too, I've been a consultant for about 20 years, professional wetland scientist by trade. I manage our sciences group here at OTAC. And I've also been working with the cities of North Bend, SeaTac, Shoreline, and Snoqualmie on best available science update. So that's a little bit about me. Let's see here. And I will share my screen. I'm still at my desk, if you guys can't tell. So if you see some of my work, I apologize if I pick out the right screen here. All right. How'd that go?
We see it?
All right. So I'll start at the beginning and I'll find the share mode, full screen. Okay. All right. So just big ticket items. Streams is regulated by the city code at 1921. Sometimes you see streams as what's called a fish and wildlife habitat conservation area. City of Snoqualmie has those as separate, but the end result is the same. Wetlands are regulated at 1912 170, frequently flooded areas, otherwise known as flood hazard regulations. There's a little bit of a crossover there, but it's the same thing. That's the regulatory floodplain, which we know that I think 22% of the city is within the Snoqualmie River floodway. The other kind of updates I'll kind of present are just sort of administrative updates. Well, I guess that we're reviewing with Emily. I'm not going to present those today because they're just trying to stay kind of high level. Or just regulatory definitions to bring the city code in line with the city definitions in line with the WAC. So there's little nuances like changes to the wetland definition and stuff like that that we're trying to just update. Let's see. So what to kind of get out of this presentation. So I'm talking to Emily. You know, we're not here to really suggest code changes, I think, at this point, but we want to give you as a planning commission a heads up about what the state is saying. Notably, Department of Fish and Wildlife, compared to what the city code says and the recommendations that they have to bring the city code in compliance with the Growth Management Act. As you guys know or may not know, the Critical Areas Code is actually the state delegating authority to cities and counties to implement the Growth Management Act. And so that's why that's sort of the hook, or actually, as you said, the teeth in terms of contract for the state bringing cities and counties in line. And as we know in Washington, that can vary widely across the geographic spectrum here in Washington, how that's implemented. So the goal today is just to sort of present what the best available science is that Emily referred to. That's with the capital B and the capital A and S, BAS, if you see that. And but this current science says, and then what the code is, and we call it kind of like a gap analysis. So I will transition to the next one. Okay. So I think the biggest one that is the focus of the state agencies and especially DFW are stream buffer widths. So you know, most of my career I've always called them buffers. There's streams, there's but there's different ways and sort of how you're approaching management of these sensitive areas to support water quality, fish, wildlife, and these kind of corridors. And it really starts with what you call them. So the current code lists them as buffers. Most codes do in Washington. The change is starting to treat these as riparian management zones. Is more of like a desired condition that what this zone is capable of, rather than viewing it as a buffer, assuming it's in a natural state. And as we all know, a lot of stream buffers aren't, whether they're limited by development, roads, residential, agriculture, whatever it may be. So it's more of like a management approach rather than just like a sort of a heavy-handed buffer, it's a natural forest, don't touch it kind of approach, because that isn't usually reality anymore. So how do they do that? So DFW put together 2 manuals, I think total about 500 pages or so. It's kind of a synthesis of the science, looking at all the academic papers, all about buffer widths and what what supports best available science in terms of protecting water quality and kind of the functions of streams. So just to list some of the functions here that they list in the report, we got bank stability, right? Erosion and sediment. We've got shade for water temperature that fish like. We got pollution removal for water quality, even our downstream neighbors. A lot of pollutants flow downstream. Let's say food source for fish, right? You have the leaves that overhang the stream, large woody debris, recruitment, and that's for stream geomorphology and all these different habitat niches. And then wildlife movement. A lot of times these streams corridors are protected and they become migration corridors for ungulates and other wildlife. And I'm a wetland biologist, so I kind of think even more on the amphibian size that they need the uplands to sort of to forage and come back, and then they breed in the wet areas dry up, and so there's a seasonality aspect to it. So you take all these kind of functions of these riparian corridors, and then the question is what's the proper size to support all these functions, right? It's for kind of like a natural stream. So the way they do that is they evaluated something called site potential tree height, SPTH, and a desired future condition. So if the goal is the desired future condition, sort of this like multi-story forested kind of forest that provides all these functions, what is a scientifically valid distance to protect those functions? And sometimes I might even include, might hear channel migration zones and stuff like that. I'm not going to do that today though. So what they do is they come up with this thing called SPTH, site potential tree height, which looks at based on the climax forest community for whatever region we're in. We're up in Snoqualmie, Snoqualmie Basin watershed. The climax tree height, at 200 years, so you'll see SPTH 200 is based on western hemlock or Doug fir or Sitka spruce. I think hemlock is the climax tree here. And then based on the soil type. So what soil type can support the actual maximum climax height of trees and forests. And then they say, well, what happens if that tree falls over? So when a tree falls over, you get that's when you get the large wood inputs and you get all those different functions and food and stuff. And so that's sort of how they use to determine buffer widths. So right now, the recommended buffer width is between 100 and 240 feet from a stream edge. We call it ordinary high water. And that's a big range. So 100 feet is the minimum because they say that's what's minimum minimum distance to remove 80 to 95% of pollutants. So if you think about like a residential yard, right? You got like phosphorus, you got nitrogen, you got pesticides or something, herbicides from like lawn care, and then a construction site, sediment. A lot of the nutrients will bind to sediment particles, so you need a vegetative buffer to trap the sediment so it doesn't go into the stream, and then you don't get the pollutant input. So they say whether there's fish or no fish, best available science right now is saying 100-foot minimum is a recommendation. to get the full suite of functions, they're saying 240. So how does that compare to the current city code? And oh, sorry, forgot about this slide. So what DFW did also is they invested time and they actually created this online map. And so that when you theoretically have a development come through, you know, Emily's department, the planning department, and they say, hey, how are we supposed to determine a buffer width? They've actually created this program that aligns the soil maps with the forest cover. And then you get, if you see here, you guys see my cursor here, you get a 200 and you get a tree height based on the tree species, the soil map, that's the King County soil map. And then you get a suitable buffer width for your site, you know, whether it's your home, your development, or whatever stream you're looking at. So that's what DFW has been up to. They've been quite busy. And they've been reaching out to a lot of counties and cities, asking them to respond to the science and how the city is going to incorporate this best available science in their code updates. That's sort of where we're at. Okay, so here's a comparison. Sorry, I can get that screen out of the way. Okay, so here's a comparison of the current code to the upcoming code. The current code is over here on the left side. This current stream classification uses class 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. These still equate to sort of the current state classification system, which is type S, type F, NP, and NS. S is shoreline, as you are well aware of the shoreline management program. F is fish, NP is non-fish perennial, and NS is non-fish seasonal. So think of like a stream that only flows parts of the year. So the common, you know, previous kind of science was, oh, well, it only flows for certain times of the year, so we're just going to give it a 25-foot buffer. And this one doesn't have fish, so we're going to give it 50 feet. And well, this one has fish, so this has more value, right, and more resources. So we're going to give an extra 25-foot to a 75-foot buffer, or a shoreline might have a 100-foot buffer, but then the natural area on the right bank of the Snoqualmie River across the way will have a 200-foot buffer. I mean, right. And so the city has you know, it's really kind of, it's almost like a choose your own adventure, which is perfectly fine. And then the Snoqualmie River, obviously, which it's constrained by the development and the existing city downtown, has a 25-foot buffer. So that's what the current code says now. If the city were to implement the current code based on DFW's recommendation, type S streams would go beyond the shoreline management plan of 200 feet to 210 to 235. All type F streams, which are most streams in the city of Snoqualmie, will be more than double from 210 to 235. And then even seasonal streams or non-fish streams would go from 100 to 235 based on sort of how the code is written or what the update is. So like I said, again, the minimum is 100 feet as recommended based on the best available science. They also would prefer that the 235-foot buffer was implemented even on seasonal streams. So that's the science. And there's different ways to, not to sort of be too alarmist, and I don't want to scare anybody, but there's different ways that from a policy perspective to sort of manage that. So you can put flexibility in the code. You can apply it on a case-by-case basis. You could say, hey, here's standard buffers. You could incentivize developers to, if you do certain low impact development, do different things, you could reduce the buffers. So sometimes people will do a standard buffer and then they'll have like a hook for reduced buffers. So there's different ways to sort of manage that, but that's just one end of the spectrum, and we're relative to where the city code is now. All right, and I'm assuming there might be a few questions after. If anybody has any right now, feel free to interrupt me.
Well, I have a question, actually. I mean, I look at the urban riverfront, that the code is 25 feet. And I know that this has been the city's a relatively older city. So I suspect that that's what it is. I suspect there's not a lot of distance between the urban area, if historic is what I'm thinking, and the riverfront. So any comment on that? I mean, what if you're at the code there? I mean, and you've got historic structures 25 feet from the water. I mean, then what?
Well, right now it's legally non-conforming, so it's fine. There isn't much advantage to increasing the city buffer to 235 feet because you're not going to take out Main Street and the development. That's not sort of a reasonable expectation. So DFW has acknowledged that, you know, and then Emily's responses that we've had so far have been, you know, the city has a ongoing program of buying out the properties that are most at risk along the waterfront. So, you know, and explaining that to DFW how the city is actively reducing risk from flooding is that's one kind of approach. In terms of like a buffer function and from a biology kind of standpoint, I mean, it's the infrastructure is not going to move, so it's there. It's not like you're going to relocate downtown even over like a 25 or 50-year period. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of managing expectations. And that was where I recommend kind of code and the flexibility, like where it's applicable, you know, have an option in the code potentially to, you know, implement the widest buffer based on best available science. So, but then you sort of, you know, then it might not, you know, that opens up another can of worms from a policy perspective. But I won't go there because I'm not a I'm not a policy expert. I'm just a scientist. So yeah, so which makes actually brings me to a good point. So you know, code's gonna have a 200-foot buffer, but if there's like an intersecting development or road, the buffer would be clipped to that. So you can have the code, but then how do you apply the code? That's another question as well. So
yeah, even with developing, you know, folks like to enjoy the river, right? I mean, so you might put a pier out there or something like that. I mean, is that, you know, would that interfere with the buffer area? I mean, because I think a lot of these short distances were so that you could enjoy the river. I mean, I think that was the whole idea.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a part of the city, and that's why we wanted to present what the science is and what the city code is to kind of get your feedback as the planning commission about what's important to you guys and as representing the city. But I think you made a good point. I mean, the whole point of the shoreline management plan is to make it, you have a public access requirement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you got to maintain the public access. So I think how you do that, you know, you provide public access, but maybe there's offsetting mitigation. And so the thing that underlies the whole critical areas code is the thing called no net loss of functions. And same thing with the shoreline management plan. So from a project per project basis, if you can design something that, you know, has been historically impacted, you know, maybe you restore a lawn to plant trees and make it a forest to offset a public trail that goes through, you know, within that buffer. And then you can kind of balance that sheet to even though you're within the buffer. And so the code allows certain uses like trails, but it also discourages uses, you know, like development, you know, residential development or something like that. There's also different opportunities like buffer averaging. And there's buffer reductions with enhancement. So there's different incentives on a kind of a per parcel basis.
Okay.
But the, you know, going from 75 to 235, I'm not going to lose light of how big that of a change that could be. So we just wanted to kind of present that to you today to see, you know, I'll kind of stop there before I get myself in trouble.
Well, what's the expectation? What's the expectation with our current code, knowing we've got you know, a town that's over a century old, and that all of our current code is well within, you know, much smaller than the buffer width that is currently recommended, other than to just be in non-compliance, or to change the code to make everything non-compliance. I mean, what I'm not sure what the approach of this is. I
Yeah,
mean, except to do it where possible, which I'm not sure, you know, in the areas I'm thinking that there's not a lot of parts possible.
yeah, and
There might be a patch here and a patch there, but there's a whole stretch of it where, you know, if you adjust the code, we're just gonna have a big section of it that's in non-compliance.
Yes, and I think Emily has brought that up too, is that most of the city in that buffer area, at least on this riverfront, is already developed.
Right.
So what's the point of expanding the buffer to 235 just to bring, half the downtown out of compliance?
Well, it's
I-
bigger than just developed. It's developed and historic.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Red's-
so
yeah.
I think those are the questions that we want to explore with you guys, to figure out how to implement some of this best available science. There will be some level, I think, recommendation of increasing buffer widths. How that's done, Emily, we've not really coordinated on how or what that would look like yet. But it'll be somewhere in between what it currently is and what the best available science is.
Right.
And
Well-
ecology and DFW will require that. And how we get there though is it's kind of the subjective part, I guess. If you
There needs to be, I'm just thinking out loud here, a non-disruptive grandfather clause for, um, you know, historic development. I mean, we just need to figure that out. Right, rather than just say non-compliant and then let that roll, because that could cause problems 10 years from now, with a different planning commission. So,
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, it's funny being a scientist. I'm always sort of like, I'm also a father of three. I live in Snoqualmie down the river. I got a house, and I'm like, that makes perfect sense. I was like, but when I put on my science hat job and have to talk to DFW, I have to acknowledge that's in conflict with their mission, and then try to work back and try to find the middle ground. Like you said, like a historical, exemption or something like that.
well, that's a
And
different
putting that
comment, actually. I mean, I bike around Lake Sammamish, and I mean, yeah, I mean, you got houses right up against the water. I bike around was it Sammamish River, same thing, right? It's right there. And they got parks and bridges and everything else around there. So, and then I swim lakes where there are docks completely circling it. So, yeah, it's I'm looking at this going, okay, maybe this is a desire, but you're gonna have to find some areas that are just not developed to actually implement it in the short term. It's just the way it is.
That's correct. Even if DFW came back and said, "Hey, we want 235 on the whole thing," it's not even practical to implement that.
Okay.
So
As long as that understanding's there, because
yeah,
these rivers are so different from how we're built right now.
yeah, and so
not just us, but everybody around us. Yeah.
that's what we're trying to find the little nuances where we can implement it and say, "Hey, DFW, we are going to update the best available science, but it's also not practical in other areas."
Well,
And I don't want to sort of quantify that yet because we're still kind of early in the process, but that is the goal.
not to rat all this, but you made a comment about DFC desired future condition. So I assume there is a criteria that we have that is based on science of why 210 feet is really what we want. And again, I'm just, like I said, I've been all around rivers and lakes and stuff in this area, and I don't see this anywhere. Anywhere that, there's a trail or development or, there are docks and lakes and kayaks and stuff. I mean, yeah, boat ramps. I don't see any place where you've got massive buffer like this to natural rivers. I just don't see it. So, yeah, so I'm kind of puzzled at the size of the disconnect. It's just pretty significant. So,
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. There's science working in a silo, using natural sites as a reference, and then there's society and reality and trying to implement the science, in a developed landscape. It's a lot less clear than, hiking around a natural area.
oh, and the natural area is enjoyed by a lot of folks who like to recreate, kayak down the river and stuff like that, right? So
Yep.
at any rate, I like if there's a definition of desired future condition of, what science was behind saying 210 feet is really what we want. It'd be kind of interesting to see that, I think. And maybe I'd missed it. I looked around a little bit of the stuff, but I didn't see. I really didn't see where that came from, other than it's it's what we assume is goodness from the WDFW. So
Yeah, and I will, excuse me. Let's see. Did I provide references? Okay. So we can provide the references to these documents, these volume 1 and volume 2, science, synthesis and management implications.
Are these the 500-page ones?
Yes, and
Okay.
then the volume 2 is the management recommendations. So that's kind of where all this is coming from. The volume 1 is the synthesis and review of all the academic papers, and then the volume 2 is how could this possibly be implemented. And again, it's kind of like a grab bag. You know, if you're, I'm trying to do the same thing with CTAC, for example. There isn't much. There's a 235 feet. I don't think across the whole city. So, so like, you know, but it's how you approach, I think, compliance with DFW and how you provide a reasoned answer and a comprehensive answer, and how we're compliant with the growth management act requirement. So,
Well, and the, no, wait a minute, and the flourishing of the citizens who like to recreate on rivers and lakes and stuff, right?
yeah, and
That's a big, yeah, that's a
and
big,
there are allowed uses for recreation, you know, like you said, docks, trails, even if there's a 235-foot buffer, you know, you can still provide access. So, you know, but what DFW doesn't want are, you know, residential developments across Western Washington or Eastern Washington, for that matter, too, squeezing the streams. That's sort of big picture. So I can relate with both sides, I guess. But yes, the value using the resource for recreation, I think those are sort of the hybrid goals that would be acceptable.
no, I understand. Without having read those book stops, I think they're missing the recreational needs. I wouldn't just say their desires, the recreational needs of the citizens. I think it's being missed there. So I'm not saying that the buffers are right, but I think, yeah, I mean, maybe I will wade through and just see if I can find that, but.
Yeah, I mean, so like,
area for recreation that would be a lot less if everybody's got a buffer and no development at 200 feet from every waterway. So,
so for example, I also work on city projects for Public Works and Jeff Hamlin. So Snoqualmie Town Center 3, the trail. I also have been involved in that one. So for that example, on the west side of 202, there's the gray area. People previously proposed like a zip line, I think, in that area and whatnot. Or maybe there's a trail that's still proposed through there. That's completely fine. It's a perfect use. It's also in the floodway. It can get flooded. It's not going to be damaged. People can still recreate. It still can provide refuge for wildlife. The city code actually ends the buffer at 202. So anything east of, if I get it right, on the other side of 202, is not within a buffer, even though the buffer, you know, on paper extends that far, but it's not implemented. So, you know, even right there, we have a whole bunch going on. A lot of it is sort of hand waving. So even if you bump up the code at 235, it's not going to have a material impact on either of those two projects. If you, and again, I also worked with, like, I forget, the community that gets frequently flooded along Gardner Creek, I think, from the Beaver Dams, or Kimball Creek. You know, implementing a 235-foot buffer out there would have much more of an impact. So that's sort of some of the nuances that we just kind of want to raise for discussion.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is what is best for fish and wildlife, and then we're taking these recommendations implemented into our land use code related to development. Is that correct? Is that how we're looking at this? So is it fair to assume that any previous developments that are already in place would remain? Right? They would be grandfathered into some capacity, and this would be protecting those areas moving forward?
Oh yes, yeah. And Emily, you can chime in here too. Yes, no, there is legally non-conforming. Nobody can make anybody move or leave. There's even redevelopment. You know, if you redevelop within an existing disturbed footprint, you get a leniency for redeveloping. But when you redevelop, maybe consider a buffer enhancement. Maybe pull back a third of that parking lot or paved area and restore it. right? And so, or for floodplain regulations, maybe consider putting that building, raising it and putting on, you know, like the high school. So it's just, you know, it's little nuances like that, but nobody's sort of going to get kicked out. There isn't sort of like once some building goes into, you know, gets condemned, then you can no longer redevelop that area. There are, you know, the code doesn't read like that. Like you can redevelop that site. At the same time, you're in the floodplain. If you're downtown, you still got to comply with the floodway regulations for FEMA. So there's other challenges too.
The other question that I had related to that map that you showed us that kind of populates where the streams are located, and does this break down which are like type or class 2, class 3? Because I would just be curious with the amount of water we have going through Snoqualmie, if we did an overlay of that 235 feet back, like where. What does that look like?
Would most of the city be encumbered? Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. Again, I think when you sort of dive in and get a little more granular, and buffers can get truncated at roads and things like that, and, you know, it wouldn't cover the entire town, but there are streams. Like we live in Western Washington. There's a lot of water everywhere, you know, perennial or seasonal or wetlands on the, you know, all three. There is, I will say, in the regulatory world too, how we do the stream typing. So something that was a non-fish bearing stream about 10 years ago are frequently being considered fish bearing streams based on the physical parameters of a stream. So it's like a 2-foot wide channel that has a surface connection to another type F stream. So previously, a lot of those streams were considered non-fish, but now biologists have recognized the value of those kind of seasonal small order streams for foraging habitat for fish. So sometimes if you make a map that's you know, type 1, 2 or class 1, 2 or 3 streams, it could also change. So a lot of times the planning department will create critical areas maps that are just used as guidance, but it still comes down to like an individual project application for how the code's implemented.
Yeah, because I mean, I think it seems fair to assume, since they've done some of the repopulating of rivers, that if we were to actually implement this, that there might become more wildlife, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, and maintaining what we have left, and
Right.
still, yeah. I would just say what we have left. It's a little dark.
Yeah,
But
dark.
I come from New Jersey, so I'm like, man, this is great out here. But I also
It
see
is great
I
out
also
here.
see what can happen if it's not, you know, controlled a little bit. So
Yeah, the other question I had was, is consideration given to which streams are feeding where, you know, like the flow of water and what will further be impacted by those buffers or lack thereof?
yeah, so there is flexibility in the code for expanding buffers based on the resource. So, you know, if there's like spawning gravels for let's see, below the falls, I think to the west or north side of the city, for salmon, I mean, that would be a high value, high resource. Maybe you put a wider buffer on that. There's flexibility in that. I don't think it's implemented very often. But it's a consideration. Yeah, so not all resources are the same. I guess I'll say that also. So then there should be flexibility. So if there's just like a stream that's, you know, draining an upland and has a small little basin and it's just kind of flows during the winter, I mean, yeah, that's going to have a different management and regulatory kind of code associated with it versus like a type F stream or this, you know, the Snoqualmie River where you can recreate and has that kind of wow factor. So they do have different functions, and hopefully the buffer would reflect that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had one more potentially controversial question. If historically, I mean, Weyerhaeuser would move the channels of the streams wherever they wanted to for the logs. I mean, if historically the streams were in a different location, because if you move the whole stream, you know, west, I mean, you'd wind up you could create the buffer. You could artificially create the buffer if you could move the stream from where it is now. If it historically was in a different place, is that even a potential?
It is in the stream restoration community.
Really?
So what they, historically, there's been a lot of manipulation. I mean, I recall 1912 or something, DuPont had a flyer that was rooting for dynamiting streams. And that so that you could streamline them and then you could have more land to farm. So that is, the historical sort of paradigm has been to move the streams to suit, humans. And so, and now it's started to reverse because by doing that, it causes issues, whether it's sediment to build up and then you have to dredge it. And there's a management headache, or culverts filled up. So now culverts are going from, pipe culverts to fish passage. And so that way fish can get upstream. So there are ways that we're learning how to do this better in terms of managing our resources along with infrastructure.
Mhm.
And that said, so when you move a stream, I actually had a discussion with a coworker the other day, is like, oh, you can't touch a stream, relocate it. That's horrible. And I was like, well, not necessarily, because you don't know if the site has a history of disturbance. And so if the site has a history of disturbance, you have a stream that's lost its bed and bank and it just kind of sheet flows across some, mud area. I mean, what's the value of that? So you want to encourage stream restoration too, when it's right. So that's why I think a lot of the critical areas code is having flexibility to have I'm not trying to promote myself here, but to have sort of the scientists sort of hash that out. And unfortunately, Emily has to listen to that sometimes when I go at it with other developers, consultants, and things like that about what's most beneficial to the city's, resources.
Right, right. Well, just an
So-
overlay of the new buffer, what that would look like. It'd also be interesting to find out if historically the river was always exactly right there, because I actually don't think it was. I think at least in some pieces it has moved around.
You
Yeah.
are correct.
Yeah. So
Yeah, you can even see like where we have the loop,
right.
whatever. What is that? Lake Horst?
Yeah.
Uh,
See.
yeah,
Boris Lake.
I think.
Yeah, but that is literally like the river used to bend through there and then it just looped off.
Well, I thought Weyerhaeuser may have done that, but anyway, that's my point.
Oh, or
Um,
that.
but you've got a whole bunch of right bank there. Anyway, if we're going to be looking at buffers and you're looking at restoration, it might make sense to understand historically where the rivers were. There might be something from a restoration standpoint that we could take a look at.
And that is a big topic, actually. It's called CMZs, channel migration zones. So gosh, 10, 15 years ago, there's a big push in Washington, all over the state, to establish these called CMZs, channel migration zones, because they have their own set of regulations. So I think you're right. I think this was manipulated somehow by Weyerhaeuser, either log boom or something, but it was also very likely an oxbow for the Snoqualmie River. So,
Right.
so river probably flowed this way at one point. At some point, now it flows over here and it left this kind of old channel. But at the same time, the river is fairly locked into place at this point with at least along this edge with 202, which why the current code allows 200 of a buffer along this right bank. So that's a good application of sort of recognizing the constraints of the city versus
Yeah.
managing the resource. But yes, rivers, streams, they move all over the place. Gosh, I'd be happy I'm not a stream restoration ecologist.
Okay.
I
I think
wear the hat sometimes, but yeah.
I think we got the point of there's some grandfathering that needs to be involved, and perhaps a little bit more understanding of history and what what potential there could be. So
Yeah, I'm making a note for that.
Union Director Atiche,
Yeah, two things. One, just I wanted to see if we could,
move it along.
yeah,
Okay.
this is a rich discussion, but he hasn't finished his presentation and we have another
Okay.
training course to do. But Jeff, I don't know if you can mention this anymore. You did mention it earlier in your presentation about this is not an update to the shoreline master plan. And, a lot of Snoqualmie has shorelines that are regulated, including the Snoqualmie River. So
Yeah, that is a big distinction. We're not updating the SMP during this round. It's just the critical areas, and there's overlap with the SMP, but we're not touching the SMP. The SMP cross-references the critical areas code, but SMP is still the driver for that.
Okay,
Those
thank you.
areas.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily.
Please
Let's-
continue.
Yeah, don't worry. I only have like one or two more. And I'll keep this high level. And there's other updates that are not as sort of extreme as the riparian management zones. There's the city have, and this is terms of wetlands. My apologies. There's like a exemption for less than 1,000 square foot category 4 wetlands. Ecology doesn't really agree with that. Their kind of synthesis of the science recommends taking out those exemptions. It's kind of a moot point anyway for applicants, because even if they do, if the city does exempt them, then they still have to do an administrative order with ecology. So everything with all the changes of the Clean Water Act and the federal level, the state has basically worked very diligently to backfill and fill in those gaps, because the feds sometimes aren't anymore. So, but you know, from our standpoint, really, they're still regulated. So they say why I have the exemption. So, so that's like a minor change. It's really hard to find a category 4 less than 1,000 square feet wetland anyway. Let's see, impact mitigation ratios, ecology, Army Corps of Engineers and Environmental Protection Agency came out with a new interagency manual in 2021. Called Agency Policy and Guidance that updated mitigation ratios. But there's not much change there. I think the mitigation ratios that the city currently has is consistent with that, but it's just updating the reference to the 2021 interagency manual. Let's see here. For wetland buffers, we need to align them with the ecology's wetland guidance for critical areas ordinance updates. They've been trending more towards averaging versus the reduction with enhancement. Again, it's sort of managing more of like a long-term approach. Removing or trimming buffers if they're disconnected by like a road or a development, and making sure that codes have that flexibility. Right, and the science is great and all, but it doesn't make sense if it's, you know, implemented incorrectly. And I would say, here's the other example for that large stream buffer is like, what's the point of having a 200-foot wide stream buffer if it extends, you know, 100 feet down slope? You're not getting much water quality. So, you know, protection from that. So there's little nuances. The buffer widths, a lot of times there's options. So a lot of codes are sort of set up where they incentivize applicants to, you have like a standard buffer, say it's 150 feet or whatever the code is. The buffer widths are fine as they are now. They're consistent with best available science, but then it's sort of how you get there. So you sort of have a standard buffer and you say, all right, but if you don't implement, you know, facing the lights away from the wetland for wildlife, if you don't, you know, sort of these minimization measures, then buffers could increase, you know, 33% or something. So you sort of have these kind of incentives, or you can base, you know, you maintain a habitat corridor to other natural areas rather than just truncate, you know, an area and make it an island. I think the whole point about wildlife is maintaining these migration corridors. So, you know, again, can it be implemented on a site? Gosh, 5-10 years ago, we weren't asking these questions. So, you know, it's just whether you can or can't, and then you force the applicant to say, no, this isn't good to, this, you know, we can't apply this to the site. Like, all right, makes sense. You know, surrounded by roads or something. Oh, and yeah, so that's the minimization measure. So, so there's probably will be an update. Buffers wouldn't change, but how you get there there might be some incentives for developers to sort of be a little more considerate of their neighbors, if you will. Let's see. And all right, frequently flooded areas. I'll try to go through this one quick. You know, FEMA, 22% of the city is within the floodway of the Snoqualmie River. FEMA compliance is required for implementing the flood insurance rate program from FEMA. There is also compliance with biological opinions recently for in Western Washington that FEMA had with NIMS. That's a biological assessment. And so projects, so the city has 3 ways to sort of comply with that. They can adopt FEMA's recommended code. They can do a case by case review, or there can be another way to federalize a project to get the ESA compliant. So, and right now the city's in that third door of a case by case. Applicants have to do prepare a habitat assessment for projects. At the same time, the city is uniquely, mostly situated above the falls. So anadromous fish, which is the main kicker in Western Washington, isn't as big of an issue as it is for other jurisdictions below the falls. Let's see. However, the science and what DFW has informed the city is that across the nation, 40% of the National Flood Insurance Program claims from 2017 and 2019 are for properties outside of FEMA map floodplains. So whether that's from climate change, whether that's just mapped wrong, or changes in what we hear about in the news of climate change, and changes in duration, intensity of storm events, and it might be increasing and changing the boundaries of those flood events. So they encourage sort of almost like a safety factor to be built in. So for example, King County, what they do is they have the baseline. They use the 100-year flood elevation as the baseline, and then they add 3 feet for compliance with their flood hazard regulations and for flood protection. So they say 100-year flood plus 3, and that supposed to accommodate kind of additional unknown, the unknown unknown, if you will, for additional flooding. And what we and we also have floodplain managers here at OTEC. We took a look at it at the city code. Right now, I'm not entirely sure anything is required, and that is because when they lowered the falls, it actually reduced the flood elevations by about 1.4 feet above the falls. And the way the city code reads is that it's based on the firms of flood insurance rate maps. And so if the flood insurance rate maps are still based on the old elevation of the falls, then there's almost like a factor already built in, a safety factor, because they're already kind of higher. So, I'm not sure how to explain that in code, but maybe that might come in handy when working or talking to DFW. Let's see, I think that's it. I think you guys are spared. Yes. Okay. All right. So that's my presentation. Are there any other questions?
Well, I think you've got I will do a quick poll. I think you've got the point that we made of our previous discussion. So I'll let that stand from my perspective. Any other commissioner want to raise your hand and ask any other questions? No? Okay. No, we're good. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. So much.
Hi, everyone. I am going to continue the video that we started the other day. Well, last time we met up, the Dave Batty presentation, Snoqualmie 101, A History of Snoqualmie.
Good.
Straighten things out for us. This is the first known photograph of downtown Snoqualmie. And that's a punch-in road there, and that split cedar that you put down in the mud so that you didn't sink in. Kinsey Livery Stable. This went through the transition to automobiles later. That's the Snoqualmie Hotel, not the Kinsey Hotel. Here's the first Kinsey Hotel. And that's Edmund John on his haunches there on the steps. Look at the baby carriage wheels. It's just a wonderful picture to have. Now here is the second Kinsey Hotel. And the bell in the Methodist Church is dedicated to E.J. Kinsey. The church building was moved across the street in the 30s and is now the American Legion Hall, which is right across the street from the Snoqualmie Council Chambers. That lower right picture is Clark Kinsey with a bunch of his photo equipment. I correspond with his grandson who has a lot of his equipment in his basement. The Reinig family. Leonard and Margaretha Reinig bought their family to the Snoqualmie Valley in 1890. Leonard made his fortune in the bakery and mercantile business in Seattle. The two oldest sons, Otto and Dio, opened the Reinig Brothers store in 1903. It burned in 1908, was rebuilt, and is now the Carmichael's True Value hardware store. Otto Reinig was mayor of Snoqualmie from 1905 to 1915 and postmaster for 31 years. Here's the Reinig family. So Eddie is the youngest one there. He was quite a genius and at a very early age was managing the Seattle City Light power plant up on the Cedar River. So, but he died young. But the back there are Otto and Dio. So, the first Reinig Brothers store on the left, the rebuilt store after the fire on the right, the original store lower left, and that magnolia that many of you from Snoqualmie would recognize was the mini Reinig magnolia. She and Otto had a house right where that magnolia is. 1903, Snoqualmie incorporates. The new little town of Snoqualmie was hit very hard by the national recession of 1893. As a matter of fact, that's the recession that killed the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad, and Northern Pacific picked them up. Then soon after, the hops market collapsed, but the town struggled on against the $300 price originally placed on lots in 1889. To bypass paying the unreasonable price of a lot, barns, homes, and outdoor houses, orchards, businesses, etc., were built in the public street access. Finally, the Seattle investors who had platted the town dropped the lot price to $45, and slowly people bought the lots adjacent to their structures and moved their structures out of the streets. Now, today, in the older part of Snoqualmie, there's lot line issues with folks' eaves going over their lot lines and things like that, and based on this challenge. Finally, in 1903, the town voted to incorporate under the laws of the state of Washington. The highest paid public official was the sheriff, who was expected to do everything. He built railroad crossings, bridge railings, sidewalks, upheld the laws, buried dead calves, collected the poll tax, worked all male prisoners every day, attended the needs of families under quarantine, and notified folks when their water closets were not in a sanitary condition. The job of the sheriff was so challenging that in spite of the high pay, it changed hands 12 times from 1903 until 1910. And then the town, full of hard living, hard drinking loggers and heavily dependent on saloon tax revenues, voted to go dry. not for very long. They really needed those revenues from the saloons. Now, how do I know all of this? I had a good friend for the 1990 flood. She was helping the city of Seattle clean up some downtown buildings. There was an older book on the floor open in the water, which was only about 1/8 of an inch deep. And the workmen were going to throw this book in the dumpster. And she said, I have a friend, Dave Batty, who might be interested in that book. It was the original minutes book for Snoqualmie from 1903, including the very first council meeting through 1914. Meadowbrook. After the hop market crashed around 1900, the hop ranch land was owned by H. Dutard, the bean and wheat king from Sacramento, California. He actually was the last treasurer of the hop ranch and loaned them money, and that's how he ended up with the farm. Dutard ran the farm under the name Snoqualmie Ranch. He sold out to Chamberlain and Hamilton, who renamed it Meadowbrook Farm. Their primary crop was potatoes, and in 1904, Arthur William Pratt purchased the farm and appointed Angus J. Moffat as manager. So starting in 1904, Meadowbrook Farm was primarily a dairy operation. Kind of fun to have a color picture, an older color picture with the cows. Hop poles were reused as cattle fencing. The category collection issue, in the 1930s, the manager of Meadowbrook Farm's house in the little town of Meadowbrook burned. With it went the photo collection of Meadowbrook Farm. So we've been trying to collect, and a Japanese family in California whose grandfather was a milker in this dairy had these pictures and sent them to us. There were 6 large dairy barns and 1 horse barn on Meadowbrook Farm, and now all of them are gone. There's a move-through under SR 202 to connect the main pasture with one of the barns. Dairy-related businesses sprung up in the area where the original Fort Alden brought Jeremiah Borst to the valley. And in 1923, Arthur William Pratt and his wife Dora platted the town of Meadowbrook, now part of Snoqualmie. Meadowbrook teams, horse barn, and equipment, April 12, 1911. So that big barn is the horse barn. All the other barns were dairy barns. It's located in the former trailer park area between Meadowbrook Way and Park Street. So it's really right across from the expanded Mount Si High. Town of Meadowbrook aerial about 1943. This is kind of wonderful if you notice how many clotheslines are out with clothes on them, because homes did not have dryers in 43. Meadowbrook Barn on SR 202 at Swing Rock. Now, if you are on 202 between Snoqualmie and North Bend, about halfway on your right-hand side, you'll see Swing Rock, or what's left of it. And in the blackberries there, you would find that concrete foundation for that big barn is still there, as well as a huge foundation for a huge silo that was on the far end. And the foundation for, on the left here, you can see the little milk house. So this is the barn that a highway underpass had to be built under SR 202 when Highway 202 went in. Meadowbrook Barn across from the current location of Centennial Park. And that concrete foundation is also there. This is the winter of 49-50, which is the ugliest, worst winter in recorded human history. Now, Meadowbrook was unincorporated. It didn't have any money. So the folks took up a collection to get a bulldozer driver to clear their streets. Meadowbrook Condensed Milk Company, and we don't have any clue where this particular building was. Meadowbrook Creamery, and we don't have a clue. This is a category photo, by the way. We don't have a clue where this building was. Angus Moffat managed Meadowbrook Farm for A.W. Pratt for almost 40 years, retiring in 1943. The farm workers were fed in the brick building now known as the Colonial Apartments at Meadowbrook Way and Park Street. Many of the workers bunked in the Hop Ranch Hotel. Other crops were raised on the farm, such as beans, corn, peas, and broccoli. For some years, a local cannery thrived. So, can you get more local than Tokel brand? So, this is the Meadowbrook label. And I had about a half a dozen folks bring these labels to me when they found I was interested in local history. Evidently, when they closed it down, the employees grabbed handfuls of these labels, and they're all over the valley. Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company, the Weyerhaeuser and the Fisher families bring stable employment to the valley. In 1900, Weyerhaeuser purchased land in the Snoqualmie Valley that was checkerboarded with Rockefeller timber holdings. The need for building material following the San Francisco 1906 earthquake and fire triggered purchase of adjacent pieces of the checkerboard by the Grandin Coast Lumber Company, and the Fishers were the principals in that company. In 1914, that's by the way the same Fisher flouring mill, Fisher family. In 1914, Weyerhaeuser and Grandin Coast incorporated the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company to build the second all-electric mill in the nation. Now, why did it take a while there? It took a while because San Francisco decided to do most of the rebuilding with brick and didn't need the lumber. This is what the forests looked like. This picture was in the mill manager's office for about 40 years. It took 2 years to plan the mill and then begin creating the surrounding mill town of Snoqualmie Falls, Washington, which, by the way, is my hometown. World War I created major manpower and material shortages. Women were hired for some jobs traditionally held by men. Japanese nationals were imported to build the logging railroad and were housed on the mill site. The mill town of Snoqualmie Falls grew to include 250 homes. That's almost exactly how many homes. A general store, 50-bed hospital, which is the largest hospital this side of Seattle, grade school, community hall, YMCA, which was the largest YMCA in Western Washington, a railroad station, barbershop, boarding house, and hotel. Boarding house and hotel were for the single men. If you rented a house, you had to have a family. This was how they guaranteed that the loggers were more stable. The heart of the mill town, 1944. So, upper right-hand corner is that hospital. To the left upper is that huge building is the YMCA. The lower left middle is the company store. There weren't big box stores, man. This was a huge store by any standards. So this is a fun aerial. Weyerhaeuser had the money to document, and Weyerhaeuser Archives had some wonderful pictures that we were able to get a hold of. 1920 aerial of Meadowbrook Farm headquarters on the left down there, the horse barn, and Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company mill. Now you see that's the older Meadowbrook Bridge. That bridge has been replaced. The upper middle is lumber drying in the open in Western Washington. But that's how they did it, because they didn't have very many steam dry kilns. Now you notice that they had cut all of the timber off of the island in the middle of the mill pond. That was to increase the airflow to dry that lumber. And that field in the front of us, that field became the town of Meadowbrook in 1923. Mill 1 was built to handle 11-foot in diameter Douglas fir and cut its first log on November 25th, 1917. Mill 2, sized for smaller western hemlock and western red cedar, opened on May 24th, 1918. Wood was a primary strategic material for World War I, and ship's timbers and airplane stock from Sitka spruce, which was very rare in the woods, were the first items produced. The U.S. Army recruited soldiers to work in the woods and the mill under the auspices of the Spruce Production Board. This is one of two pictures we have of women in the mill, World War I. Now the fun thing is that the open catalog on the lower left is a Kinsey catalog. So the Kinseys would come in, take pictures, and sell those pictures to both the mill management and the employees. Japanese, this is a fun, I want to point out here, this is the Japanese community, but notice right in the middle of the little boy, very soon there were families in the Japanese community. Now, so to this group goes the honor of the largest daily output of logs in the state of Washington. Can't be
Another 20 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, so it'll be a third section for this, which into the future agenda list, if you can share that.
Okay.
Our next agenda is going to be
Okay. And it's August 5th because there's 5 Mondays in July. Yeah. So 2 Mondays from now is the 29th. Okay. 3 weeks from now. Gotcha. No? No? Okay. I will do a quick round robin for items of planning commissioner interest. Vice Chair Testman,
None for me tonight. Thank you.
Commissioner Kilcup,
No, nothing.
Mr. Smith,
No, no real items. I mean, it's I guess more of a comment, as it seems like we had a safe and successful 4th of July. Didn't hear of any reports, so hopefully that's a good sign.
good. Okay. And I also have no comments at this time. So staff, anything from your end? Okay, at this point, I'd move to adjourn the meeting. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the July 15th Planning Commission meeting is adjourned at 8:31 p.m. Thank you, everybody.